It was as if someone had pressed the off button on a soul that had always shone with light. Her name was Eleanor Grace, but everyone in the neighborhood simply called her the lady who prayed for everyone. For more than 30 years, she had kept a thick prayer journal tucked in the living room drawer. Every page listed neighbors' names, dates of surgeries, births, prayer requests, and thank you notes. It was as if she had a secret agreement with God. No one would face a battle alone. But now, sitting silently in the corner of a hospital room, Eleanor stared at the white wall as if she had never learned how to see the world with the eyes of the soul. Her daughter, Sarah, was by her side. The sound of the heart monitor filled the room like a cruel clock marking the time of an approaching loss. The doctor had said it was advanced Alzheimer's. Sarah received the diagnosis with the kind of courage you pretend to have, but inside, everything in her was screaming. How could God allow someone who had always spoken with him to no longer remember a single word? Eleanor hadn't spoken in weeks. Sometimes she made incoherent sounds. Other times she just stared at a fixed point, as if something was happening in a place no one else could see. Sarah tried everything. She brought old photos, sang hymns her mother used to love, read scripture out loud. But it was like throwing seeds on hardened stone. Nothing took root. One night, while cleaning out her mother's dresser, Sarah found the old prayer journal. She opened it at random. For Jason, surgery scheduled for the 12th. For Mrs. Collins, who lost her husband. For myself, so that I never lose my faith, even when I can't understand God's ways. It was Eleanor's handwriting, but Sarah no longer recognized the woman behind those words. It was impossible not to think about how cruel time could be. How could a brain forget everything but suffering? Eleanor didn't remember dates or names, but sometimes she would cry at the sight of children in the hallway, as if, deep inside, something still whispered that she had lost something precious. Sarah spent entire days at her mother's side. With each extended silence came a suffocating fear. What if this was the last time? What if the next visit found the room empty? And no matter how hard she tried to be present, she felt alone, like she had been left in a desert with no map, no compass, and no promises. One day, a hospital chaplain passed by the room. She entered, offered a short prayer, and said a sentence Sarah would never forget. Sometimes the spirit keeps praying, even when the mind falls silent. Sarah smiled politely but didn't believe her. Not then, not in that condition. The next morning, Sarah returned earlier than usual. She brought an old Bible, the same one Eleanor used to read when her eyesight was still good. She placed it gently on her mother's lap, opened it to Psalm 23, and began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, ... double quotes, nothing, no reaction. But deep down, something in Sarah refused to give up. The faith her mother had once planted inside her still burned dimly. Maybe, but not gone. That afternoon, she decided to try something different. She turned on her phone, opened the voice recorder, and started talking out loud. Double quotes, "Hi Mum, it's me, Sarah. I know you're tired. I know your mind doesn't always cooperate. But I just wanted to tell you that the neighbor's son Jason, he got married. Remember him? You prayed for him every Saturday. Well, he got married, and guess what? He said you were the reason he found his faith." Sarah paused. A tear fell. "And I need prayer too, Mom. I don't know how to pray like I used to." That's when everything began to change. Eleanor took a deep breath, a much deeper one than she'd taken in weeks. Her eyes, which always looked lost, gently closed, and then her lips moved. Sarah froze. She thought it might be a twitch, a random sound, but no. The words had rhythm, they had purpose. It was a sentence, then another, and another. It wasn't modern English. It sounded like an ancient prayer, rhythmic, almost melodic. Sarah grabbed her phone and hit record. She had to capture this. She didn't know what she was hearing, but it felt sacred, and in that moment, caught between disbelief and awe, a single question overwhelmed everything. How could someone who no longer knew how to read recite something they'd never been taught? And the answer was still to come. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind like a song she didn't know how to sing, but one that made her cry. It wasn't just the shock of hearing Eleanor speak again. It was what she said, or better yet, how she said it. Every word felt infused with something beyond her force speaking through her, shaping disjointed sentences into sacred verses. Was it a prayer? A memory? Was it God? Still holding the phone, Sarah found a pair of earbuds, stepped out onto the hospital balcony, and hit play. She listened, then again, and again. Her mother's voice was there, fragile but steady. It wasn't Babel, it had purpose. And for the first time in a long time, it had faith. She tried to write down what she could understand. Some of the words sounded familiar, but they flowed in an ancient cadence, almost as if they were part of a sacred text. Sarah went to bed at 3 in the morning, her heart racing, a lump in her throat. How could that prayer live inside a woman who had already forgotten her own name? The next morning, she decided to show the recording to one of the nurses, a young woman with deep brown skin and a warm, constant smile. Her name was Nina. Sarah knew she was a believer. Every time she entered the room, she let slip a phrase, like God is good or He's still working miracles. Sarah trusted her. "Can I show you something?" Sarah asked, holding the phone like it was something too fragile for the world to touch. Nina listened. Her eyes widened slowly, unblinking. "This is biblical. I don't know exactly which part, but it has something to do with the heavens speaking. Something like that. Do you have more?" Sarah shook her head. "That's all I managed to record." She just said that and went back to silence. Nina tilted her head, eyes shining. "This isn't just sound, Sarah. This is a message." Trying to understand what had happened, Sarah did something she hadn't done in years. She looked for a church, not one of those traditional ones with wooden pews and old hymns, but a quiet room on the hospital's ground floor. A small cross on the wall and a sign above the door that read, "Room of Hope." That was where patients and visitors passed in silence. Searching for answers the doctors couldn't give. Inside, there was a shelf full of Bibles in different languages, and a small table with the sign, "Leave your request. Someone will pray." Sarah sat down, pulled out her phone, played the audio one more time. An elderly woman with grey hair pulled tightly into a bun approached slowly. She wore a name badge, Chaplain. Her name, Mrs. Adeline. "That's from the Old Testament," she said. Before Sarah could ask anything, "It's Psalm 19. Sarah froze. She had never heard of that psalm before. Her eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure? I recognize the melody. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands." That's the one. No doubt. A knot formed in Sarah's stomach. That passage had never been read aloud to her mother. Eleanor hadn't attended church in years. Since the illness advanced, she hadn't even touched a Bible. And even before that, she only ever referenced the popular Psalms 23, 91, never 19. But how could she know that? Sarah asked, nearly choking on a silent cry of desperation. Mrs. Adeline gently took her hand. Maybe she didn't learn it. Maybe she received it. Those words sank into Sarah's heart like soft arrows. It wasn't a rational explanation, but it was the only one that made sense. And for some inexplicable reason, she believed it. When Sarah returned to the room, Eleanor was asleep. Her features were softer, more at ease. Her brow wasn't furrowed like before. Her breathing was peaceful. The very air in the room felt changed, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted tones. Sarah sat beside the bed, pulled the chair close, and took her mother's hand. "I know you can't hear me like you used to, Mum," she whispered, "but I heard you, and now I'm going to repeat what you taught me without even knowing it." She opened the Bible to Psalm 19. Her voice trembled at first, but gradually grew stronger, verse by verse. The daughter now became the voice of her mother. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Those words felt like they had been written for that exact moment. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Sarah closed her eyes. She felt a strange warmth in her hands, as if something was flowing not from her, but through her, as if that prayer had a life of its own, crossing generations, silence, and diagnoses. Then Eleanor moved her lips again. One sentence, just one, but clear. "He still speaks." Sarah felt the world spin beneath her. She no longer knew what was possible or impossible. All she knew was that something had happened, something no medical explanation could capture, something that didn't come from the mind, but from the spirit. And in that moment, she understood. That voice that came from her mother wasn't just hers, but what that voice was trying to say still hadn't been fully revealed. Sarah spent the rest of the day in silence, sitting on a wooden bench in the waiting room, her eyes fixed on a random spot on the wall. But inside, a storm. Her mother's words still echoed in her mind like an invisible bell. "He still speaks." It was impossible that that sentence had come from nowhere, and even more impossible to believe it had come from just a human source. Something was trying to reach her, and Sarah knew she had to go back to the beginning to understand. The next morning, she decided to visit the house where she had grown up, a small red brick home on the outskirts of Louisville. The place still smelled like old coffee, damp firewood, and unresolved memories. In the living room, a picture frame of Eleanor smiling held a small, aged slip of paper. "Pray for the ones you love as if it were your only chance." It was handwritten. The lettering was steady, balanced, full of faith. Sarah walked down the hall to her mother's old room. Time seemed to have stopped there. On the vanity sat a Bible knot, the same one she had brought to the hospital days ago. This one was different, older, thicker, its leather cover stained by time. Sarah opened it carefully. The pages were fragile, some stuck together, others already loose. One was marked with a faded blue satin ribbon dot. It was Psalm 91, of course, her mother's all-time favorite, but that wasn't what she was looking for. She flipped through more pages, and for a moment, she thought maybe it had all been a coincidence, that the psalm Eleanor recited had been a random memory, a leftover from somewhere. But then, as she neared the back of the Bible, her heart suddenly began to race. There it was, Psalm 19, highlighted in faded yellow. But what truly caught her attention was the writing in the margin. The ink was almost gone, but still legible. "This psalm, I've never read, but I've heard it in my heart." Sarah brought her hand to her mouth. A chill ran down her spine. It was impossible, or maybe it was exactly what needed to happen for her to believe again. How could she have written this? She murmured, as if expecting the house itself to answer. She pulled out her phone and compared the audio with the verses in the Bible. It was the same text, word for word, no variations, as if Eleanor had direct access to something that wasn't taught or read but received. From that moment on, Sarah began to see everything differently. Every detail from her childhood, every phrase her mother had ever said, every bedside prayer, it all now felt like clues to something greater, a pattern, a calling. She returned to the hospital to show the Bible to the chaplain, Mrs. Adeline. "I don't understand. This psalm, it was here, and this note." Sarah pointed to the words in the margin. It's like she knew before she ever knew. The chaplain read in silence, then gently closed the Bible. "Sarah, your mother may not remember the name of a grandchild. She may not recognize the sound of her own voice. But there is a part of her the disease could never touch, a place the mind can't reach. And that place belongs only to God." The sentence lingered in the air like something sacred. And in that moment, Sarah realized something she had never noticed before. Her whole life, she had searched for answers, explanations, logic, but faith wasn't about that. Faith was walking even without a map, believing even when silence lasted for weeks. And now, perhaps for the first time in years, she was starting to walk again. In the days that followed, Sarah returned to the hospital not with sorrow, but with purpose. She sat beside her mother and read Psalm 19 out loud. Sometimes Eleanor smiled, sometimes she closed her eyes, but always there was peace. Then one morning, a new nurse entered the room. His name was Lucas, young, freshly certified, with eyes full of hope. He saw the open Bible, recognized the psalm, and said, "My grandmother used to call that the psalm of God's voice. Said the heavens speak of him without words, and when we can't pray, it prays for us." Sarah looked up, surprised. "You've heard that before, since I was a kid." She said it's what kept her alive after she lost her son in a car accident. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. It was like everything was starting to connect. People, stories, prayers, like some invisible thread had been tying hearts together through the centuries using words that didn't always come from lips, but were never left unsaid. And then, that same afternoon, something even deeper happened. As Sarah read the psalm for the 5th time, Eleanor squeezed her hand tightly. Her eyes were filled with tears. No words, just tears, but something in her gaze said more than any sentence ever could. Sarah didn't ask anything. She simply closed her eyes and cried with her, because in that moment, there were no more questions, only one truth. She had heard, and maybe she had been listening all along. That night, Sarah woke with a restlessness she couldn't explain, a strange feeling, like she was forgetting to remember something. She rose quietly from the hospital recliner, looked at her sleeping mother, and stepped out of the room. She needed air, but more than that, she needed peace. She walked the long corridor lit by sterile lights until she reached the small prayer room at the end. The same one where she'd first met the chaplain. The same place where Psalm 19 had first been recognized. She sat down and pulled the Bible from her bag. She opened it again to that psalm, but this time, she tried to read it as if it were her first time. The heavens declare the glory of God. There was something in that sentence that seemed to pierce through the paper, as if creation itself was trying to speak to her. Sarah wasn't a theologian, never had been, but a sensitivity was beginning to grow inside her, as if her mother's spirit was planting seeds where there had once only been pain. She read the verses slowly, savoring each line. Verse 3, there is no speech, there are no words, their voice is not heard. Verse 4, yet their voice goes out into all the earth. That's when she understood, not with her mind, but with her heart. Her mother hadn't remembered the psalm, she had received it. The prayer didn't come from memory, it came from eternity. Sarah closed her eyes. She felt a presence in the room, as if that small space had become an altar. A warm peace filled her chest, and for the first time since the diagnosis, she felt like everything was exactly as it should be. She found Lucas, the nurse, reading something on his tablet. You know, she said, breaking the silence, that psalm speaks to people who can't hear. Lucas smiled, and two people who can't speak. Sarah sat beside her mother's bed. The lights were low, and Eleanor's breathing was slow, almost in sync with the monitor's soft beeps. She opened the Bible again. Mom, I want to tell you something. This psalm you recited, it doesn't just speak of the sky. It speaks of you, of your life, of who you've always been. She read verse 7 aloud. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. Looking at her mother, she continued, maybe your mind got tired, but your soul never stopped speaking to him. Then she opened a new page in her mother's old prayer journal and wrote, today, she didn't pray for anyone, but God prayed for her. In the days that followed, Sarah felt something shift in the hospital. Nurses who used to pass by quickly now lingered at the door. One of them, named Rebecca, began bringing small flowers, quiet and simple. She said something in that room reminded her of her grandmother. Another, named Denise, asked if she could sit and just listen to Sarah read the psalm aloud. She said she wasn't religious, but that something about it touched a place inside her she couldn't name. Her mother's Bible remained open on her lap, like a totem, a symbol of something larger than time, medicine, or fading neurons. And each day, even without words, Eleanor seemed more present, as if she had discovered a secret language, one where God and soul met without sound, without logic, only faith. One morning, while opening the bedside drawer, Sarah found a wooden box. Inside were handwritten cards, verses, promises, notes. One read, when I forget who I am, remind me who he is. She pressed the small paper to her chest. Tears ran down without asking. Sarah understood now. Her mother's faith had been her inheritance, but the psalm was the legacy. That afternoon, sitting by the bed, she began to write a letter, not to her mother, not to God, but to herself, to the version of Sarah that would exist after the pain, after the absence, after the goodbye. Dear future Sarah, if one day you forget how to pray, come back here, come back to this bed, this room. Remember the woman who taught you to hear the heavens even when no one else was listening. Remember there's a language that needs no sound, a faith that requires no explanation, and a psalm that lives where memory can't reach. Before sealing the envelope, she looked at her mother. Eleanor slept peacefully, her forehead calm, lips gently curved like she was listening to every word. Sarah leaned in, touched her mother's face, and whispered, if one day I forget, Mom, remind me. And then she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She took Eleanor's hand, closed her eyes, and prayed out loud. Lord, let your voice continue to echo where mine cannot reach. Let your word be hidden where forgetfulness can't enter. Let Psalm 19 become the language of my soul, and let my faith never need to remember, only to feel. That night, before falling asleep, Sarah wrote a new phrase in her mother's prayer journal. There are memories that don't live in the brain, but in the spirit. And in that moment, she realized the miracle was not recovery. It was revelation. The forecast had called for clear skies, but Sarah felt that Thursday carried a different weight. She woke early, a strange pressure in her chest as if something was about to happen. She dressed slowly, dabbed on the light perfume. Her mother always loved lavender, with a hint of vanillion, left in silence. On her way to the hospital, the city felt slower, as if the whole world was holding its breath for what was coming. When she entered room 407, she noticed the lights were dimmer than usual. The window was cracked open, letting in a soft, almost shy breeze. Eleanor was asleep, but something about her was different. Her breathing was steady, like someone silently reciting something. Sarah moved closer and, for a moment, hesitated to wake her. She sat down and opened the Bible once again to Psalm 19. It had become her new ritual. Every day, at the same hour, she read it aloud, not hoping for a miracle, but because she already understood. The miracle was what was happening while she read. But that day, something held her back. Her hands trembled. Her voice faltered. Sarah looked at her mother and couldn't read. Instead, she spoke to God, not as someone who makes requests, but as someone who surrenders. Lord, if this is the time, let it happen in your way. But if there's still something she needs to say, let me hear it, even if it's just one word. And that was when Eleanor opened her eyes. Sarah held her breath. Her mother's eyes were clearer than ever, present, deep, holding a lucidity that shattered any diagnosis. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand and, with a strength that seemed to come from her very soul, said, "Read." Slowly, Sarah took the Bible with trembling hands, opened to the psalm, took a deep breath, and began. The heavens declared the glory of God. With each verse, Eleanor closed her eyes. Her lips moved gently, as if silently following the words in a divine rhythm. Verse 7. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. Sarah began to cry. Eleanor, with a whisper of a voice, said, "Again." Sarah read it again, slower, deeper. And then, out of nowhere, Eleanor began to recite the next verse, word for word, with the precision of someone reading without looking. Sarah choked on her own sobs. It couldn't be, not at that stage, not in that condition, but it was happening. And amid the emotion, an old memory surfaced. When Sarah was a child, she'd once been seriously ill. High fever, hospitalization, days of uncertainty. Back then, her mother spent entire nights on her knees beside the crib, reciting Bible passages she never knew where they came from. They always felt spontaneous, like they flowed from a place. Only Eleanor had access to. Now. It was as if that place had opened once again, just for them. Just for this moment. Eleanor held her daughter's hand tightly. "He's here," she said. Sarah simply nodded. No more words. Only tears. Nurse Rebecca entered quietly and stopped at the sight of them. She said nothing, just placed the tray of medications on the table and left. She honored that moment as if she was standing on holy ground. When Sarah finished reading the last verse, Eleanor looked at her, smiled, and whispered, "Now, I remember." Those words didn't just mean memory. They meant reconnection. They meant eternity. Sarah stood, pressed her forehead against her mother's, and whispered, "I remember too, Mum. Now I remember everything." Minutes later, Eleanor fell asleep. But it wasn't ordinary sleep. It was peaceful rest. Like someone who had fulfilled a mission. Like someone who was ready. Sarah remained there for hours, not moving, not thinking, just breathing the presence of something unseen, but deeply felt. By late afternoon, the heart monitor began to slow. There was no panic, no rush. Rebecca returned, Lucas too. They both knew, and Sarah knew as well. She held her mother's hand until the very last moment, and when silence filled the room, there was no pain. There was peace, a peace that didn't come from the end, but from the certainty that something was only just beginning. Sarah stood, closed the Bible, and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me to hear heaven, even when I heard nothing at all." She walked over to the window, looked at the sunset, and realized the whole sky seemed to beat in reverence that day. Time didn't move forward. Time stood still, so that something eternal could step in. 2 days later, room 407 was cleaned, sheets changed, the bed disinfected. To any hospital staff, it was just part of the routine. But to Sarah, that room was sacred ground. She asked to step in one last time before it was officially released. The room was empty, but it didn't feel unoccupied. There was something there, a presence, a soft scent of lavender and old pages. The Bible still lay on the table, and beside it an envelope that it hadn't been there before. Sarah picked it up gently, folded in half, her name written in shaky handwriting. Her mother's inside, only one sheet. No date, no greeting, just a single sentence, written with quiet strength. If one day I leave before you hear me, don't grieve, just read the sky. Sarah let the paper fall onto her lap, and for the first time since Eleanor's passing, she smiled. Not a smile of pain or resignation, but a smile of someone who understands, someone who accepts, someone who has been touched by something greater than time, illness, or even death. At the reception desk. Before leaving, she was called by one of the hospital's administrative assistants. A woman named Emily greeted her with a hesitant look. "Are you the daughter of Mrs. Eleanor Grace?" Sarah nodded. Emily pulled out a form. "There's a note written by a staff member from the night your mother passed. You might want to read it." Sarah took the paper. It was a statement signed by a night shift nurse named Lydia. The letter read, "That night, around 3:20 a.m., I heard a voice coming from room 407. I thought it was strange, given the patient was in terminal condition. As I approached, I realized she was awake and reciting, word for word, with clarity. The tone was solemn, steady. Even though I didn't understand all of it, I knew it was biblical. I wrote down what I could recognize. It was Psalm 19, the entire thing. After that, she closed her eyes and passed. Sarah read it, then read it again. Once more, her mother had crossed the boundaries of logic. She hadn't just heard, she had remembered. Or rather, she had never forgotten. That was the moment Sarah understood the psalm hadn't been for Eleanor. It had been for her, for everyone who needs to hear God's voice when life goes silent, for those who grieve quietly, for those who care, who suffer, who wait, for those who pray without answers. Sarah went home carrying her mother's Bible, the prayer journal, and the envelope in her coat pocket. That same night, she wrote in her diary, "God spoke to my mother when no one else could, but maybe he was speaking to me the whole time." Weeks later, Sarah did something she never thought she'd do. She recorded a video. She wasn't an influencer, never liked social media, but she felt this story needed to be told. With a trembling voice, tearful eyes, and the Bible in her hands, she said, "My mother died without remembering my name, but before she left, she taught me the name of God all over again. Not with rehearsed lines, but with a psalm no one had taught her. It wasn't stored in memory, it was hidden in her spirit." She then read Psalm 19 out loud, all of it, as if echoing her mother's final prayer at the end. She said, "If you're hearing this, and someone you love is fading, suffering, or forgetting everything, don't lose hope. There's a place Alzheimer's can't reach, a space even death can't cross, and in that place, heaven still speaks." She paused, and with a voice thick with emotion concluded, "Comment the name of someone you love, or write a word of faith, because someone out there might need to hear it in silence, and maybe so does heaven."